Okay, so sorry about the delay, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to be hosting this conversation. My name is Natasha Overdoon, and I will be moderating our discussion today. I work with the Polis Project and the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, and again, I'm just really delighted that we're having this important conversation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is coming to you live from the University of Victoria, which is on the traditional lands of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. The university specifically is on the lands of the Kwantlen and West Saanich peoples. Just a brief word about this series. Today's webinar is the fourth event in the Polis 2016-2017 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, and we're in our 7th season of these webinars. And I know that some of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, the goal is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space and engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And today's webinar is the product of a collaboration between Polis, SEER, and BC's First Nations Fisheries Council, and we're delighted to be co-hosting this discussion. And before we get started, I very briefly wanted to frame the context for today's discussion. Research, practice, and legal rulings have established that a priority winning condition for watershed governance in BC, which is ultimately about getting to better outcomes in water and improving how we make decisions, is co-governance. Co-governance is what we're really interested in today, and co-governance involves meaningful partnerships and shared decision-making between Indigenous and non-Indigenous decision makers and communities. But there's a recognition that a precursor for co-governance arrangements is that First Nations must have the internal means to develop and articulate their community's water values. And there's examples, exciting examples all over BC of First Nations leading, driving innovative watershed governance approaches. But despite this leadership, there's also some capacity gaps that constrain progress. And our purpose today is to better understand some of these capacity gaps and also look at some of the significant achievements and progress that is being made. So through our presentations, we're going to get kind of a bird's eye view, as well as from the province at large, as well as hear stories and perspectives from two communities who are working on water initiatives. And we couldn't carry out this webinar series without the support of our various partners, and all of them are listed here on this slide. So I just want to say a big thank you to all of them for their core support to this series. Before I hand things over to the speakers, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through. The first is that I have a blanket mute on everybody since we're expecting so many listeners today. There's almost 200 people registered for this webinar, and I see that we have close to 150 on the line, which includes I know that there's a number of groups tuning into this. So I have everybody muted so that we don't have audio feedback to distract us. And to deal with questions, we'll use the chat box in the bottom right corner of the screen, so you can put in your question, and I'll moderate by reading those out as they come in, and the speakers will answer them. And we'll have that question period after all of the presentations are done. Because there's so many people on the line, I'll do my absolute best to keep up with all of your questions. I'm expecting a very rich discussion, and if you think I may have missed you, please enter your question again so that I see it. The final housekeeping item is that now is a nice time for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Who you are, what your interest is in water, a weather update from where you're located. And I'll also suggest that when you tell us where you're located, you also note the traditional territory that you're in today, and take a moment to look it up if you're away from home, somewhere new, or if you're unsure. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have 4 great speakers with us today. The first is Kate Cave. She's my colleague at SEER. So I know firsthand that she's passionate about protecting our environment and is strongly committed to ensuring Indigenous communities have a voice in water stewardship and governance processes. Kate has a BA in Environmental and Native Studies from Trent University and an MES from the University of Waterloo. And Kate has over 12 years of experience working in the environmental field and with Indigenous communities. And she has worked with SEER since 2014 and is a program manager. Genevieve Layton-Cartier is also on the line, and she is the Freshwater Project Coordinator with the First Nations Fisheries Council of BC. Her work focuses primarily on engaging with and supporting BC First Nations to enhance their participation in governance, planning, and management of freshwater for fish and aquatic ecosystems. And Genevieve, in her spare time, like probably most of us on the call, can be found exploring BC's beautiful coastal areas. We'll also hear from Shannon Squire, who is a governance advisor with the Papetla Council, which is the traditional governance arm of the Klekit community. The mandate of the Papetla Council is the protection of title and rights on behalf of the past, present, and future Papetla, which are part of the Stát'imc Nation. Shannon has had the privilege of working for the Stát'imc people for 20 years, first as an advisor for the precedent-setting negotiation settlement with BC Hydro, then founding a community-based development corporation in her current position. And finally, we're also going to hear from Ashley Doyle, who is the Manager of Lands and Resources for the Kwantlen First Nation. Ashley has worked for Kwantlen for 4.5 years and has a degree in anthropology from the Kwantlen Polytechnic University. She also has a professional certification in land management from the National Aboriginal Lands Managers Association and recently completed the land use planning program offered by the Nutsuwak Tribal Council. And I'm sorry, Ashley, if I mispronounced that. Ashley oversees all governance correspondence related to consultation, so referrals, and engages all levels of government on topics related to Aboriginal rights and title. So I see that your introductions are coming in. I hope you feel a sense of community in this room and sit back to enjoy the presentations and formulate your questions. So with that, I will hand things over to Kate and Genevieve, who will provide this province-wide kind of look at Indigenous watershed initiatives and set the stage for the presentations from Shannon and Ashley. So Genevieve and Kate, it's *6 to unmute your line, and you can take it away. Can you hear me now? Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
It looks like I'll have to
Thank you.
I'll have to manually unmute you.
I tried to do it. It didn't work. Thank you.
We can hear you loud
Natasha.
and clear, and Genevieve, I've unmuted you as well.
Great. Thank you, Natasha.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us for the webinar and for the opportunity to be here and share this research as a way to begin understanding what can be done to advance the capacity of BC First Nations to engage in freshwater planning and governance and to find different solutions. As Natasha explained, I work with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. We're a nonprofit environmental organization that works with Indigenous communities across Canada on different environmental projects. We've been around for about 22 years. We were based in Winnipeg for about 20. For the last few years, we've been virtual, so we have staff across Canada that work with communities within different regions. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes going through a few of the slides, and then I'm going to pass it over to Genevieve to speak to you to the latter end of the presentation. is just a brief outline of the presentation that Genevieve and I will provide. So just a little overview about the systematic review, then talking about the research findings and opportunities and next steps. So about the systematic review, it was a partnership between the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, CER, and First Nations Fisheries Council, and we had funding provided from a number of different funders you will see down here on the slide. And just a reminder that the report is available online on both CER and First Nations Fisheries Council's website. If you haven't had the chance to review it or download it, then please feel free to go to either site and do that. And if you have any questions after the webinar today that we didn't have time to answer, please feel free to contact either of us, and we'd be happy to talk to you further about it. So for those, I understand that there are a number of participants on this webinar that are from across Canada. So for those who aren't aware, the BC government is undergoing a multi-year overhaul of major freshwater regulations, and through that, the development of the Water Sustainability Act. So anecdotally, we knew that First Nations in BC have low capacity but a high interest in the planning, management, and governance of water, which includes the lack of capacity to engage in the creation and implementation of the Water Sustainability Act. We wanted to understand what these needs and identify the current opportunities for First Nations. So we undertook a systematic review to identify different water and watershed initiatives and co-governance arrangements that were happening across the province. To accomplish this, we undertook a series of project activities, which are listed here on the slide. These activities were guided by a set of questions that related to water and watershed planning initiatives, traditional values, laws and customs, governance, and First Nations capacities and needs. So it's important to note that the survey with First Nations organizations and communities, it represents approximately 25% of BC First Nations. So we are missing about 75% of the First Nations from across the BC region. And also like to reflect that we shared and confirmed the results of the lit review, the survey, and the interviews that were conducted in the social network analysis at a First Nation Fisheries Council water planning and governance workshop last April. So just a few reflections on the research findings. So the first one is, I'll just share a few of the interesting survey questions that we asked and the results from those questions. So about half of the First Nations that responded indicated that they're in the process of writing a document to protect water in their own territory. And these documents were developed at various scales and vary from acts of self-governance to developing collaboratively with non-Indigenous partners. This wordle here, which is, apologies, hard to, I think, read some of them, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of documents that include freshwater protection and governance provisions. So several First Nations are engaged in a wide range of water and water-related governance and management initiatives such as these. And you can see the different types on this list here. There's water declarations, there's water bylaws, and different frameworks. There are a number of different water quality environmental monitoring initiatives and land use vision plans. We also asked respondents about whether these documents reflect traditional values, laws, and or customs. And several respondents indicated the need to be able to discuss what these values, laws, and traditions are and how to articulate and use them in planning, which points to a need to support communities to articulate these as a critical part of the water planning process. We also found out that over half of the participants indicated that they have other types of plans to freshwater protection, so not just water related. So these could include cultural preservation plans, land use plans, different forestry plans, and you can find a list of these different documents in the report that's found on the SEER and First Nation Fisheries Council website. I'm going to pass it over now to Genevieve, and she'll continue talking about the findings.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Natasha, can you hear me?
You sound great.
Okay, great. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm delighted to be one of the presenters on today's webinar, and I'm just going to continue on with what Kate was saying. So, still in the findings, really looking at, when we were asking First Nations representatives about key challenges that they experience as they move towards, let's say, water and watershed governance and co-governance. The main one is really capacity and resources. There's very limited financial support available for Indigenous freshwater management and governance. And even though there is some internal technical capacity, which we'll talk a little bit later, there's still a strong reliance and need to seek external support, such as contractors, for writing materials and reports, which doesn't build necessarily internal capacity. And then the second challenge that came up was really that government relationships are generally poor, and there's a lack of recognition of rights and lack of consultation, and the overlapping jurisdictions, provincial and federal, for water make it quite complicated, and they don't fully, First Nations don't always fully have access to government like they would like to have their questions answered. And based on the survey, looking at the raw data, there's the weakest relationships with local government, but not much better relationships with the provincial and federal governments. And this includes both government staff as well as political leadership. So then other challenges that were reported less frequently are access to watershed resources, inadequate government policy and laws, so regulations and standards not being adequate, and then internal capacity challenges, such as having poor community participation and lack of champions because there is such low capacity and resources, so that becomes really problematic. It's like a snowball effect of the low capacity. And so just to sort of sum it up or provide some stats here, 0 full-time freshwater staff exist in BC and First Nations. There are, of the First Nations that we interviewed, and there were approximately 68% of nations that said they had either a staff or elected leadership person working on freshwater, but in a very part-time capacity. There is no one working on freshwater in First Nations full-time, or at the time that we were doing the interviews anyhow, but I don't think it's much better as of now. 50% of those have actual, their main jobs is in lands and resources or lands and, or natural resources. And they generally, I heard this over and over again, the expression of, you know, different lands and resources or natural resources stop telling me, you know, the freshwater file that with the new overhaul of the freshwater legislation in BC, like that, we know it's important, but we have so little capacity. It's, the expression was time and time again, it's really on the very, very, it's on the corner of the desk, and we get to it sometimes, but it's really not the priority. yeah, so basically most nations that have someone working on freshwater, only this person or people only spend less than 25% of their time actually doing so. And the majority of nations in the research reported that they have an annual budget of less than $30,000 to engage in freshwater governance and management. And so a quote is from a survey respondent. Please excuse the wonky PowerPoint. I think we had a little when we update. I think when Natasha updated the PowerPoint to the webinar system, I think it's gone. There's a little. You'll notice there's a couple wonky slides. So apologies for that. We'll be sending out the slides afterwards without the wonkiness. So yeah. So folks often said, we can't be proactive when we don't have the people, time, technology, or money. And so if First Nations had enough resources and capacity, they said that they would prioritize internal watershed planning, and that's really important because we know that before First Nations, more and more, just based on what First Nations are saying in BC, that before they can really enter into collaborative governance or management arrangements, they really need to understand the full scope of policy, legislation, and also work on their own, understand their own values and needs around freshwater. And so that was really important. And then, of course, shared decision-making arrangements with the province, education and community engagement, community-based monitoring and data collection, and then participation in collaborative initiatives for freshwater protection. We asked a question about what they would like from a First Nations water network in BC, which would mean First Nations attending webinars and workshops and learning from each other, doing a lot of peer-to-peer learning and networking and having some information shared with them. But the one thing that really was the most of interest to them was this peer-to-peer learning, so sharing experiences, connections, and knowledge with other First Nations. And here at the First Nations Fisheries Council, we've been developing a First Nations water network for the last couple of years and really trying to focus on what the First Nations are saying they need most support with. So we did a social network analysis, and the purpose was to assess strength and relationships between First Nations, other levels of government, and NGOs. And the preliminary results were that BC First Nations are generally operating in isolation with regards to water planning and governance, with a few exceptions. NGOs and other levels of government do not play a significant role in improving the level of collaboration, and First Nations with more internal capacity are more likely to collaborate with other levels of government and NGOs, sort of what I was mentioning before. So the summary of the key findings, internal capacity building of First Nations is really necessary for effective co-governance to occur. With enough capacity, most First Nations are interested in engaging in collaborative water and watershed planning, management, and governance, but even if there is agreement between the Crown and a First Nations on the type of shared decision-making that potentially could happen, if First Nations don't have capacity, they can't adequately engage in these kind of processes and initiatives. There's a critical urgent need for increased capacity First Nations to understand and engage in the Water Sustainability Act, regulatory development process and implementation, and sharing experiences, relationships, and knowledge, as I was saying, is the most valuable attribute for the First Nations water network. So now opportunities following this research. So we identified challenges, and now we're going to go through, think and look through some of the solutions that these challenges, that can address some of these challenges. And I'm going to look at 3, but there are other ones too. And so the first one is to support key capacities of First Nations for water governance. And so the challenge really is limited sustained financial resources for First Nations. The impact is, as we were talking about, inadequate capacity of First Nations to engage. And, the solution, one potential solution is to establish a government fund and or delivery mechanism to specifically support freshwater planning and management of First Nations initiatives. And when we say to support key capacity for water governance, it's important to mention that there really, as I said before, that there's really a gap in terms of internal planning. And the funding would really be to support generally more internal planning at this stage for many of First Nations, so that they can work on understanding their community needs and values, and so on and so forth, to better engage in, to be able to engage in planning and management and shared decision making with government and potentially other non-Indigenous stakeholders. The second opportunity is to support a functional Tier 1 process or processes. And Tier 1, this lingo is used in the fisheries world here at the First Nations Fisheries Council when working with First Nations and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so Tier 1 means just communication and management processes open just to First Nations, which is really critical for First Nations. They say it over and over again, and it's very important to have a solid Tier 1 process before doing Tier 2, which is engagement with federal and provincial governments and First Nations, and then Tier 3 bringing in other non-Indigenous stakeholders. And so the challenges between the First Nations and the, let's say, provincial government regarding freshwater management currently. And the impact is there's really a potential for disruption of small and large-scale projects and a missed opportunity to collaborate and share decision making. And a potential solution is to support coordination of a tier 1 processes that can then lead into Tier 2 and Tier 3 engagement. Opportunity 3, I'm going to speed up. I think I'm over time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit, is to create a process for First Nations to engage in the Water Sustainability Act regulatory development and implementation. So as I was saying, many First Nations would like to be more involved, but there are limited opportunities. And so the impact, there's been very tenuous buy-in support from First Nations for the implementation. And again, a missed opportunity to collaborate and share decision making. And so there's a couple solutions here. Would be for the government to support the development of an integrated water referral response guide for BC First Nations, and to co-develop a Tier 2 process for engagement on the WSA and the remaining regulatory development. So next steps for, I wanted to mention before we go to the next steps following this research is that something really interesting is that there are more and more groups and organizations that are working on supporting, trying to develop the capacity of First Nations to engage in freshwater planning and governance. And so you'll see there's a whole bunch here. I won't name them all. You can maybe come back to the PowerPoint presentation later and look them up. And we, as and the council here, we initially convened a meeting in the fall, and now we're meeting with these other organizations quarterly and working on a variety of issues that can help build the capacity of First Nations. And here they are. So something that we didn't mention in some of the solutions, but something really that is up and coming is there is an increased number of initiatives looking to revitalize Indigenous laws and governance systems, and that's here at the council. We don't work on that, but there are other groups in this BC First Nations Water Capacity Builders Network that do, such as the Environmental Law Centre, the University of Victoria. And so our short-term steps for SEER and the council here is to continue to communicate the report findings, to further develop the First Nations water network, including looking at establishing topical and regional working groups that can, so more at the Tier 1 level, and that can then feed into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 engagement. Support First Nations communities to explore and develop regulatory options as part of the WNSA implementation, including those based in Indigenous water laws. Ensure alignment of various initiatives supporting First Nations capacity and freshwater planning and watershed governance in BC. Conduct research and develop recommendations for new sustainable funding and delivery mechanisms to support freshwater governance, planning, and management initiatives. And finally, to connect interested First Nations identified through this research with funders and collaborators, if so that they can look at further opportunities and funding. So I think I've gone over time, Natasha. I'm really sorry, but thank you very much, and please feel free to connect with Kate or I following this webinar if you have any further questions.
Thanks, Genevieve and Kate. I think that presentation gives us a really useful kind of province-wide look at some of the opportunities, some of the challenges. So we can look at that now in two very specific contexts. So Genevieve, I see that you've muted. That's great. Shannon, I'm going to unmute you right now. Kate, should be able to hear you.
Hello.
There you are. Perfect. Thank you. So I will make myself quiet again and look forward to this presentation.
Thank you. Hello, friends. My name is Shannon Squire. I'm the Governance Advisor for the Papetla Council. The Papetla Council is the title and rights arm of government in the Klekit community. We have 4 pillars of governance here, where we've developed a non-colonial structure. So we have Chief and Council in their community only deals with programs and services from INAC. Our council deals with all title and rights related issues. We have an Elders Council that deals with justice, culture, spirituality, and language. And we have a Youth Council that's, whose purpose is for developing the future leaders. So our council's comprised of family heads from each domain in the community. So the families appoint their family representative, and we all sit together and make discussions, and the decisions are made collectively on behalf of the entire community. So when I say we're part of the Stát'imc Nation, we're part of some communities, First Nations communities refer to themselves as a nation. When I say Stát'imc Nation, I'm referring to the larger collective of First Nations. There's 11 communities that make up the Stát'imc Nation. So, here we go. I wanted to make sure that we were grounded in the right place when we're talking about water in Stát'imc territory. We're not going to talk about Aboriginal court cases on title and rights or the UNDRIP or any of those legal precedents, although that would be an interesting conversation to have at one point. For the purposes here, I wanted you to make sure that you could really see where we're at and ground this conversation in the right place. We're going to start with the picture on the right, which is called a Stát'imc Lake, or Shkamkane in the language that the Stát'imc people speak. This is an important cultural body of water because this is a place where traditionally fishing has happened for generations. We also have a landlocked kokanee here that is culturally important. We have, this was a main site for purifying, bathing in water, and any of the cultural ceremonies and purifying ceremonies are usually done at this lake. So the bottom line here is I just wanted to illustrate that the connection First Nations communities and members feel to the water is very real. We start and end our meetings, every meeting, with a prayer, and our prayer is to give thanks for the lands and the water and the bounty, and a reminder to ensure we're doing our best to protect the waters and the lands for future generations. The picture on the left is the Bridge Glacier, which is a major glacier that feeds the Bridge Stát'imc Watershed, which we are a part of. And why I included this picture is it's one of the fastest receding glaciers in North America. So for First Nations whose decision-making is comprised of the concept of making decisions on behalf of 7 generations into the future, it's somewhat problematic where our glaciers melting at such a rapid rate. We're not necessarily going to have the capacity or the water that we're going to need into the future. The next slide, let me get to the next slide here. The next slide is just the Fraser River is on the left. It's a major artery throughout the province. It's the main artery for fish, which is the soul and the center of Stát'imc culture. And just as another example of the kind of relationship that the Stát'imc do have to their waters courses, is I just wanted to bring up the example of Mount Polly. Although the Mount Polly disaster did happen farther north than us, the trauma that the community members did experience as a result of that impact was quite severe. And I was surprised a little bit by that because just because we were so far away. But people here were quite upset and traumatized by the impacts to their brother fish and sister water, and what being afraid to fish for fish which have sustained you for time immemorial is problematic. On a happier note, I just put my favorite picture in there on the right, which is just a happy place, which is a nice, healthy Cayush Creek, beautiful forest, beautiful mountains, beautiful sky, to end up on a happier note. So this is a consistent message. This next slide is First Nations perspective on water rights. And this is a consistent message that you're going to hear no matter what Indigenous group you're talking to. Recently, you've heard all the news and publicity about Standing Rock in the States. This is an example from the Interior Alliance Indigenous Declaration on Water from 2001. The Stát'imc are part of the Interior Alliance, so this declaration just shows as another example of the importance of water to First Nations. As Indigenous peoples, we raise our voice in solidarity for the protection of water. The Creator placed us on this earth, each in our own sacred and traditional lands, to care for all creation. We've always governed ourselves as peoples to ensure the protection and purity of water. We stand united to follow and implement our knowledge, laws, and self-determination to preserve water, to preserve our life. Our message is clear: protect water now. So First Nations perspective on water. This is a huge generalization. I'm almost offending myself writing this because it's such a huge generalization, but there's some just key points that need to be brought out. So I always assume people know nothing about our experience in First Nations world, so I'm starting at scratch. So there's a lack of recognition of title and rights to the water. First Nations believe they have a title or an ownership claim to the water because we were here first, as well as a right to water, which is different from other user groups. First Nations, other user groups were not, First Nations are not stakeholders in these conversations. We have an authority and a responsibility that's quite different than other user groups as First People of the land. Water allocations were often issued with the reserve. When the reserves were originally allocated, there was water allocations attached to the reserve allocations, particularly in a place like Lillooet, which is where we live. It's extremely hot and dry, and the land would have meant nothing without the water. These water allocations have not been acknowledged necessarily by the provincial government, so it's problematic because as we talk about fit for later, it doesn't really fit into, fit for only accounts for selective parts of history. Traditional knowledge, anytime you deal with First Nations, you always hear about traditional knowledge, and our values and our knowledge about the water have not been valued or considered in decision making. And this is always concerning to me because what science is based on is repetitive patterns of test and result, and that's what First Nations knowledge of the land is, experience based on year after year experience and result of what the land and how it's going to behave. We need to protect the quality and quantity of water for future generations. We've already talked about that value. And water is a fundamental part of the holistic system. This is straightforward to me, but this hasn't been our experience in conversations and negotiations we've had with various entities and proponents in the territory. This is a concept that we've had to work to educate people on our decision-making process and the holistic nature of it. So I wanted to give you a higher level picture. So as I said to begin with, I represent one of the communities, and the 11 communities make up the Stát'imc Nation. And the Stát'imc Nation, we refer to the Chiefs Council, which is where all 11 chiefs sit. And at the nation level, they're doing some awesome work on water. One of the projects is the RELAW project, which is a revitalization of Indigenous laws for land, air, and water. So the Stát'imc are one of the nations that are participating in that. And the end product of the project at the end of May is going to be some sort of water statement or water policy or water values. We're not exactly sure. As a result of a 20-year negotiation with BC Hydro, the Stát'imc in 2011 reached a $209 million settlement with BC Hydro. As part of the settlement agreement, Stát'imc Governance Services was created to implement the settlement agreement. And one of the departments within Stát'imc Government Services is our environmental department. And Dr. Sue Sager heads up that department along with her Stát'imc technicians that are doing all this great work. So a couple key projects at the nation level that the SGS is taking on is Bridge Stát'imc Strategic Watershed Plan. So what this is getting all the data sets from all the users, all the tenures, grazing tenures, water license, mining tenures, putting it into one system called the Trivian system. We have the most current mapping system in the province, and all of these data sets are being cleaned up to make them accurate and actually put in the Trivian system. The Bridge Stát'imc Strategic Watershed Plan will help us be able to make informed decisions about users who want to use the lands or the waters within the watershed. SGS completed a water crossing project, and what a water crossing project is there's about 10,000 kilometers of roads in the Stát'imc territory, and about 3,584 road crossings. Now, road crossings are important because the roads fundamentally alter the water flow and the ecosystem function. They can alter the water flow and ecosystem function. So knowing how many water crossings we have is key to making better land management decisions about where we're putting our roads. eDNA is something that our technicians have been trained so they can take water sampling from water bodies and be able to tell the stocks of fish that are in there without having to do fish testing. So that's exciting. The most recent project that SGS is engaged with is called a snowpack analysis, and what that is gathering 35 years of snowpack data and snow imagery, and we're for the purposes of seeing how climate change is occurring in Stát'imc territory and linking that to major fire events and things like winter mule deer winter range habitat. So again, the purpose of all of these would be to gather information so we have more technical information to make informed decisions and recommendations to our leadership. And to be clear, none of this awesome ongoing work that's being done would be done. We would not have the capacity or the ability to do this if we didn't have a settlement agreement with BC Hydro, and if the Stát'imc communities didn't decide to put that money towards reinvesting it into the lands and the waters to create a healthier environment. We would not have the capacity to do any of the work if that settlement agreement wasn't in place. So at the community level is a little bit different, and you've got a wide range of abilities within the nation of capacities. And so at the Papeetla Council, at our neck of the woods, the Papeetla Council, we organized and hosted a water forum for the nation. So why we did that was to get all the communities on the same page about our water values and our water opportunities for management, what we're doing at the community and nation level for water management, and just being grounded again in the right place. We've done some work on wetland projects. Again, Lillooet's very hot and dry, so we don't have many wetlands, and we really want to protect them for the protection of the diversity of wildlife. Wetlands are critical, so we've done some wetland work. We're at the beginning stages developing water values, the water statement, and water policy, which we've backed off on a little bit due to the RELAW project. So that's our portion of the Papeetla Council's portion of the community perspective. Chief and Council also are concerned about ensuring they have water for future, for the members into the future, and again, that's where the whole Fit For argument is. So there's a legal or political argument to be made for against Fit For. The practical position is, First Nations need to make sure our community members have water into the future. And the problem is we don't always have the funds to develop the water licenses. And magically we're supposed to pull this money out of our hat so that we can pull these water license applications together and have the engineering components of that done, which we're not funded for to the extent that we need to be funded for. The community chief and council are also doing drought planning, water conservation planning, and all the communities, both Chief and Council, Papeetla Council, and other communities in the northern Stát'imc are also dealing with hydro and a major change in water flow regime that's happening in our territory. The water flow was set, the operational goals and water flows were set through the water use plan and was attached as part of the settlement agreement. Those water flows have been significantly changed since that was signed off in 2011. For an example is the Stát'imc communities had negotiated hard to get some more water released out of Terzaki Dam because it wasn't releasing any water into a major fish-bearing stream. So the Stát'imc communities negotiated hard, and they were able to get 3 and 6 CMS out of there. Now BC Hydro is releasing flows of up to 200 CMS in a major fish-bearing stream. So we're spending a lot of time dealing with BC Hydro and their ongoing impacts in our territory, to our lands and our ability to use our main watersheds for fishing. Now this is what we're getting to, and I'll just say ditto to what Genevieve was saying earlier about the barriers. And Kate, they've nailed it right on the head. The barriers to First Nations participation in any discussions, including water discussions, are real. They are real, and there's a list of these things I've put on here, but what I really wanted to do is just to give you a couple examples so that when you're thinking about these barriers, do you have some context to what this really means? I just want to give you a couple examples. In our southern communities, called the Inshuksh communities down south, we had 3 communities that had a major power line through their communities but didn't have power. They were running off of diesel generators. Now this has got nothing to do with water, but it illustrates the kind of ongoing daily issues that we're facing. So these remote, isolated communities had the insult of being 20 minutes as the crow flies from Whistler and having no power. So that was finally discussed and negotiated out so the communities have a reliable source of power. But up until the 2011 and 12, they were dealing with diesel generators, and the diesel trucks wouldn't always go down the road to deliver fuel to their communities. So sometimes it's hard to care about what's happening with Water Sustainability Act and other pieces of legislation when your communities don't have power. I want to give you another example of, again, not related to water, but that helps illustrate the barriers that we are really facing is just dealing with a contract. Somebody offered us a flagging contract in a different position that I held. And I said, okay, flagging, I can do this. I had to look. We didn't have all the equipment. Okay, so we have to have a quick trip over to Kamloops to get the equipment. That's a 2 to 3 hour drive depending on where you live in the territory. Oh, wait, while we get there, the stores don't accept PO. So if I didn't have a credit card, I wouldn't be buying the equipment. So I buy the equipment, get the equipment back to the community. We don't have a place to put the equipment that's locked up. I have to clean out sheds to lock up the equipment. I have to get flaggers. Well, hopefully we have flaggers that are certified in the communities. I need a flagger. I have to go talk to the flaggers, but no one has phones because phones cost money. And unless you're working full-time, you don't have access to phones. So I have to go knock on people's door and leave messages. And if they're not home, then I have to go back repeatedly. When I do get the flagger arranged, what this means is now if they may need to have travel. Do we have a flagger that's got a driver's license and has a car to get to the site? If they do have a car to get to the site, do we have gas to get into the car? These are the kinds of examples of the steps that most people don't really appreciate you have to take in First Nations world just to get people to the table or just to get a simple contract into place. And I say these again, not in relation to water, but to remember these when you're thinking about the barriers. There's lack of stable funding. We have people working part-time on land resources. These people are so spread thin, it's unreal. When we do have discussions with the province or engagement, we don't have the money to hire our hydrologists or geomorphologists to support us in these technical conversations. So we're at a loss before we get going. We have a lack in the capacity in the communities to fully understand and engage in natural resource conversations. You may have a lands manager, but that lands manager, no one can be an expert in fisheries and forestry and mining and everything else the lands people have to deal with. It's not realistic to expect that, but often those positions are for one person, in our communities at least, for one person, and those people are spread very thin. While the province really promotes the public engagement of the Water Sustainability Act as a real win, even with all the efforts the province made to engage people, the First Nations communities were not fully engaged in a process like Water Sustainability Act. The First Nations are also creating, or the province is also creating 2 tiers of First Nations, the haves and haves not. There's a lot of government-to-government relationships through strategic engagement agreements, and those communities that don't have those in place, we don't have the same level of engagement and consultation as they do. Again, this is my last slide, and because I'm running late again. So, lack of funding in communities to gather information like environmental flows. That's the Water Sustainability Act talks about critical environmental flows. The province doesn't give us that kind of data set, and we don't have the money to hire people to go out and monitor the flows of our waters. We don't have good water source or data sources of water in the territory. So we're asking our leadership to make informed decisions based on data that isn't full and comprehensive, which is, again, offensive to me. We have a loss of our traditional knowledge about water because of climate change. Our traditional indicators have changed, and they're like the culture we're evolving, and that's not really an issue, but it's sad to see that our traditional knowledge that has been held for generations has to evolve because we have such an impact on our environment. We always have reactive conversations, never proactive. It's always, the next speaker does a lot of things with referrals at Stát'imc, and so do we. And the referral process is very frustrating because it's always reactive and never a proactive how we can best manage the watershed as a whole. For the Stát'imc, we have a lack of government-to-government discussions on key issues of importance. We don't have anything the government wants in this territory. We don't have a mine where they want something from us, so we are not high on their list of priorities for a government-to-government process. For our community does a lot of capacity building within our membership. So it takes a lot of time for our staff to go out and try to educate our public and our members to make sure they're informed of what's going on, aware of what's going on, and have a good, full understanding of the issues that are being dealt with. The discussions on water management are still happening in the provincial government box of values, which does not meet the needs of First Nations. It really doesn't. No matter what proponent you go to, their colonial perspective and infrastructure is what we're dealing with. So it is another barrier when we talk about co-management and co-governance. I have yet to see, and maybe I'm being negative, Nellie, but I've yet to see a really great model where our values are being considered at the same value as the proponents in the territory. So I think that was it for me. I just wanted to take the opportunity to as well to say thank you to First Nations Fisheries Council, who's done awesome work on waters and bringing First Nations and BC together to talk about these key issues. So I do really appreciate your efforts. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Thanks, Shannon. That was extremely, extremely rich. That level of detail, I think, is critical to help everyone who's on the line here and others understand what water governance management looks like from a community and a nation perspective. So thank you, and I'm sure there will be questions. If people do have questions, you can start typing them in now so I can make sure I'm organized to respond to all of them while our next speaker gets started. So Shannon, I'm going to mute you, but I'll unmute all of the speakers when we do get to our question period. And Ashley, you should be good to go now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Great. All right, so I guess I can just get started. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited to present to you today about Kwantlen First Nation freshwater planning. Again, my name is Ashley Doyle, and I'm the Manager of Lands and Resources for Kwantlen First Nation. And I've been with Kwantlen for about 4.5 years in the Lands Department, and I have a background in anthropology, resource management, and land use planning. I'm a certified lands manager from the National Aboriginal Land Managers Association. And I just want to take this time to thank the First Nation Fisheries Council for inviting me to speak, and for POLIS for hosting this webinar today. So I think I'll just dive in. Just a note on this first picture here. So you're looking at Squalet's Channel, which is on Kwantlen IR6 in Fort Langley. And this is a location that we did some habitat restoration work back in 2009. So I love this picture, and I just thought I'd share it with you guys. So just a quick overview of my presentation. Sorry, just one second. So I'm just going to quickly just go over what I'm going to talk about. So who are Kwantlen, Kwantlen governance, major waterways and watersheds, threats and cumulative effects, Water Sustainability Act, past freshwater initiatives, and future initiatives. So again, with one of the previous presentations, the PowerPoint came out a little bit wonky, and I see that happening with mine as well. But the picture on the right is from last year's Oolican catch. And that's always a kind of it's a pretty big deal in the Kwantlen community when the Oolican come up. That does only happen once a year, very short time frame. So, and they're a threatened fish in Kwantlen territory, and the impacts from their decline have really been felt. So I'll just dive into who are Kwantlen. So Kwantlen First Nation is a fishing community that's lived along the Lower Fraser River in southern British Columbia for countless generations. They are a Coast Salish community. There's about 260 members, about half of which live on reserve. Kwantlen Traditional Territory spans the areas now known as Richmond, Delta, New Westminster, Surrey, Langley, Maple Ridge, Mission, and Abbotsford. So the scope of the traditional territory is very large. We deal with a lot of different municipalities. Kwantlen has 6 reserve holdings in Langley, Maple Ridge, and Mission. And there were 3 additional reserves that were sold in the 1950s under unknown circumstances. And these 3 reserves were located in what is now New Westminster next to the Patello Bridge, New Westminster on the other side, the New Westminster side of the Patello Bridge, North Surrey on the opposite side of the Patello Bridge, and Glen Valley in Langley. CM Kwantlen Business Group is the branch of Kwantlen First Nation that manages lands, resources, and economic development. So that's who I work for, is CM Kwantlen Business Group on behalf of Kwantlen First Nation. So next slide. The picture got a little bit squished, but this is just an overview of Kwantlen traditional territory. You can see how large it is. It covers a lot of area, and the provincial government uses this territory as their basis for consultation with Kwantlen and for sending us referrals. And the community overview, again, this is kind of squished, but this is just showing Kwantlen's current reserve land holdings. So starting from the left-hand side is McMillan Island, IR6. That's where I'm located today. That's where most of the community lives. That's where all the band administration offices are. So that's in Fort Langley. And then moving right, IR5 and IR1 are located in Maple Ridge. And then IR2, 3, and 4 are located in the Lower Stave area in Mission. So Kwantlen governance. Kwantlen has a hereditary chief and council that have served the community for over 20 years. Our chief is Chief Marilyn Gabriel, and also Councillor Toomey Anott and Councillor Les Antone. Kwantlen lands are managed under the First Nation Lands Management Act. So that's specifically Kwantlen reserve lands, not traditional territory. In June 2015, the community voted to enact the Kwantlen Land Code, which is a document that replaces 32 sections of the Indian Act related to the management of lands. So previously, Kwantlen reserves were managed by INAC, and since the community voted on this new land code, now management of lands is with Kwantlen, and that cuts out a lot of the INAC bureaucracy, which is really good for the community. It's a really big step in self-governance. The Kwantlen Lands Advisory Committee meets every second month to discuss matters related to lands management and the development of laws under the Land Code. And once a month, the Kwantlen Elders Council meets to receive updates on all activities happening in the band and to discuss and vote on important decisions. So we've got a few different committees. Just give you a snapshot of the governance. So some of the major waterways and watersheds in Kwantlen territory, there's many streams in Kwantlen territory that are of significance to the nation, but I think the most important one is, of course, the Fraser River. The river's provided abundant resources since time immemorial. It was a major transportation corridor. And I think most importantly is the cultural significance of the river, which I'm not even going to attempt to put that into English words because I can't. I've tried in the past and it just always falls short. But the cultural importance of the river it's integral to the Kwantlen identity, and it's so important. Yeah, you can't even put that into English. The Stave Watershed is a core part of Kwantlen territory. So the Stave Watershed, that used to be the Stave River. There was once a major village site in the southern Stave near the location of the current Ruskin Dam. There's over 50 registered archaeological sites with the provincial archaeology branch. Kwantlen First Nation does a lot of the archaeology work in that area. We always have our field workers up there doing that work. And the Ruskin Dam and Stave Falls Dam have greatly impacted Kwantlen's ability to utilize the area. So like I said, it was formerly the Stave River, but now it's known as Stave Lake and Hayward Lake, and there was massive flooding in the area. All we see now is remnants of the village sites. that used to exist, and that's really impacted Kwantlen's ability to use that area for fishing or resource gathering like they used to. And then lastly, the Salmon River and the Nickel River, which are much smaller streams, but they provided access to Crescent Beach and other areas for trade purposes, and also for fishing. So threats and cumulative effects. So Kwantlen is extremely concerned about the industrialization of the Fraser River that has taken place over the past 100+ years. We've kind of seen it all. So there's log booms. Continually, there's an increase in tanker traffic, timber mills, which admittedly timber mills have actually gotten better over time, but that's one of the few things that's actually gotten better. There's increasing industrial facilities, and everything has impacted the health of the river. And of course, a lot of these industrial projects, 20 years ago and beyond, Kwantlen was never consulted on any of this stuff. So we're just being consulted on a lot of these new projects in the past 10 years, I'd say, after court cases and such. So there's new infrastructure projects that are also of concern to Kwantlen. So the George Massey Tunnel Replacement Project, the Portman Bridge, which is already constructed, that replaced the previous bridge, the Patello Bridge replacement that is coming up, and the Golden Ears Bridge that was recently built. The province and the port have not done a proper cumulative effects study of the development of the Lower Fraser. The provincial environmental assessment process is too narrow to properly address the cumulative effects issue. And we've called multiple times for a holistic cumulative effects study to determine the impacts of development on the Lower Fraser. This is something that we repeat ad nauseum in every development project meeting that we have that stems from referrals that we receive, but it often it falls on deaf ears, and nobody wants to lead a cumulative effects study. We strongly feel that should be led by the port, the federal government, and the province, but to date we haven't received anything that responds to our concerns in a meaningful way. So with each of these projects, it just seems like death by 1,000 cuts. Whenever a provincial environmental assessment does take place, it's very narrow in scope, and it's just not looking at the full picture. The Water Sustainability Act. So this is just kind of a basic overview of some of our concerns. So there are some fundamental issues with the newly enacted Water Sustainability Act. So Kwantlen was never really consulted on this act, and there's no acknowledgement of Aboriginal rights entitled to fresh water, which is also what the previous speaker spoke about as well. And I think that this is just hugely problematic. The whole concept of first in time, first in right, which is in the Water Sustainability Act, this leaves out First Nations and gives priority to existing permit holders, which is very frustrating because First Nations were obviously first in time and first in right, but get left out. The province is generating new revenue from processing these permits, but they're offering no capacity funding to First Nations. And this is an issue because we're receiving an influx in referrals from the Water Sustainability Act, and this is very onerous because we receive upwards of 200+ referrals a year. And there's only, well, currently we have 3 full-time people in our lands department right now, and all of us are just so stretched that, as in the previous presentations, we can only spend just such a small amount of time on freshwater initiatives and focusing on the Water Sustainability Act, that we just don't have the time or the capacity to really dive into it, unfortunately. So on to some of the more positive stuff, some of the initiatives that we've done in-house. We have done a number of habitat restoration projects. back in from 2013 to 2016, we got funding from the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk to do an inventory of Salish suckers in the Salmon River. Salish sucker is a small little fish that is endangered. It's on the Species at Risk Act. So we did an inventory over 3 years, and that had a community outreach program with it. So we created brochures and posters and had information tables at events to try and raise awareness about this little fish. We got additional funding in 2015, again from the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk for an oolakan project, which, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, oolakan is hugely important to Kwantlen, and the decline has just been felt so strongly by the community that we thought it'd be appropriate to do a project solely for oolakan. So we did an inventory of oolakan in 10 known fishing locations around Fort Langley, and we conducted ethnographic interviews with Kwantlen fishers to document oral histories. Sadly, that last little bit is cut off there, but we also did a community outreach program with that as well. So again, brochures, posters, information tables. One of the coolest things that we did with that one, I thought, was we created a kid's coloring sheet that had information on oolakan, and that little fish on the bottom there, that's drawn by one of our community members. We just had that in black and white, and we had that on the coloring sheet for kids to color in, and we thought that was a really good way to engage the youth, both on reserve and off reserve. And yeah, they turned out to be hugely popular. So other freshwater initiatives that we've done. So we did do a Western Painted Turtle project, and sorry I left the dates out on this slide, but this was in 2015 through the Interdepartmental Recovery Fund. We did population monitoring in the Stave watershed for Western Painted Turtle. We had our community members go out and do capture and release tagging, basking surveys, emergence monitoring, and identifying habitat restoration sites. So that was a really fun project, and that built a lot of capacity with some of our team members. The picture that I had in the first slide, the Squalet's Channel restoration on McMillan Island on IR6, that was done in collaboration with TI Corp as a result of the Portman Bridge project that had impacts to Kwantlen territory. So this was like a habitat offsetting project for that. And it's improved the flow of water in that particular stream, and we're definitely seeing a return of fish, which is awesome news. And back in October 2016, so actually pretty recently, we hosted a workshop with Raincoast Conservation with funds provided by the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, titled Creating a Vision for Salmon Habitat in the Lower Fraser River. And this brought together many different stewardship groups, First Nations and municipalities, just to talk about how we can all come together to really put our minds to improving salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser, especially in light of all of these development projects that are being proposed for the Lower Fraser. And bottom picture, bottom right, is one of the painted turtles that we caught and tagged and then released again back into the stave. So future initiatives, I think this is my last slide. So CM Kwantlen Business Group always strives to incorporate new environmental initiatives in all economic development projects. That's something that is really important to us, and we want to just really set a good example that, you know, yes, making money and you know, profits is important, but not if you're damaging the environment. And it's important to always keep in mind opportunities for benefiting the environment or creating a legacy project of some sort. We continue to seek out opportunities for habitat restoration work and species at-risk projects. So looking for a lot of the federal government funding programs. We're still applying for those to continue doing some of this good work. And the CM Kwantlen Lands Department will continue to voice concerns about the cumulative effects of the industrialization of the Fraser, and will continue to work with the province to address our concerns about the Water Sustainability Act. Again, this is something that's quite difficult for us because we have just such little capacity compared to these very big government organizations, but we continue pressing on and voicing our concerns wherever possible. And yeah, it's definitely a huge challenge for us, but we just do the best that we can. So just some of the pictures on the right-hand side. So you'll see one of our members, Fern Gabriel. She's our language teacher in the community. She's just an amazing lady. She's doing a summer walking tour in this photo here. She's got her little dog in the backpack that she brings with her everywhere. But these walking tours are done every summer, and they are free to the public. And I encourage anybody that's in Fort Langley over the summer to check it out. They're very informative, and Fern, she speaks in the Hunkaminam language and talks about some of our stewardship initiatives and brings everybody down to the Squalet's channel, where we also have this interpretive sign that she's standing next to. And then the picture on the bottom is from the workshop that we hosted back in October, creating a vision for salmon habitat on the Lower Fraser. And that's the group of us that participated in the workshop. And thank you very much. This is the last photograph that was taken by one of our members just a few months ago when it was really frosty outside, and I just love this picture. And it shows the Bedford Channel, which is just on the south side of McMillan Island. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much, everybody. Looking forward to taking any questions or comments later on.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And between the two of you and all three of the presentations, I think we've gotten a very very tangible sense of what the barriers and challenges are. But you've also given us a huge range of examples of negotiations, plans, restoration projects, and internal community conversations. So yeah, a fantastic discussion. And we had a couple questions come in here, so I'll just read those out. And for anyone else who has questions, feel free to enter them, and we can have a discussion period here. The first question was from Murray Ball, and he was asking Shannon, but I think that this is actually pertinent to all the speakers. Do you find support from ENGOs? And what would that look like, and how would that support your initiatives? So that was directed at Shannon, who I'll just unmute here. But I think it'd be great to hear from you, Ashley, as well. And I'd be interested in your questions on that question too, Kate. And should be unmuted now, Shannon.
Hi, Murray. Thanks for the question. It's Shannon. The short answer is no. We're not working with NGOs, and we are in the process of planning to figure out a strategy. A lot of our stuff is grant funded, so a lot of what we can do is based on access to funding. So it is a bit problematic for like projects or planning. But it's definitely an avenue that we can look into further as we proceed with this.
And I can speak a little bit to that question as well. Ashley Doyle here. We have worked with environmental NGOs in the past, particularly with Raincoast Conservation and Canadian Freshwater Alliance for hosting the workshop back in October 2016. They did provide a lot of support in that initiative, and I think that was really the key for us because we're just so stretched that we can't. It's very difficult for us to manage projects on top of our huge workloads. So having that support was really key to the success of the projects that we've done. Also with some of our environmental habitat projects, I know that we've engaged with environmental NGOs as well, particularly on the Western Painted Turtle project. It was the Western Painted Turtle recovery team, and there was, I think it's the Greater Vancouver Zoo as well, had their assistance as well. So yeah, we've done some work with environmental NGOs and certainly hope for more in the future.
Thanks. And, yeah, I'd be interested in your reflections on that question as well, Kate.
As a national nonprofit organization, we tend to reach out to local, regional environmental groups. So I think in BC, one would be Water Wealth, for example, that we worked with, Ian, who's on this webinar. Hi, Ian, on the Chugway Tribe Watershed Planning Initiative that we had. So finding local regional support is really important because we're a national organization. We're not core funded. So when we look for funding to work with communities, if we have someone regionally that we can collaborate on with the community, then it provides, it not only helps with the proposals, but it helps with then having someone local to maintain the relationships with the community and help provide some of that technical support that maybe we can't provide. So we're always open to building those relationships with other organizations.
Thanks, Kate. The next question we had here was around cumulative effects. So someone in the UVic room, which is just down the hall from where I am, is asking about cumulative effects studies, and there's been a response that the group at UNBC is focusing research on that area. So glad to see the connection being made there. But it actually raises, I think, another question that I had around cumulative effects. I was interested, Ashley, if there was potential for collaboration on water between nations for whom the Fraser is significant, and what that might look like from your perspective. You mentioned the workshop with the NGOs helping support that. Was there discussion of collaboration at that workshop?
Yeah, there was a discussion of collaboration at that workshop, and also in other venues as well. We certainly enjoy working with our neighbors wherever possible. There is also the First Nation Fisheries Legacy Fund, which has 6 First Nation members, and we've collaborated before on habitat projects on the Lower Fraser. I didn't include that one in my presentation, unfortunately, but the 6 First Nations worked to do rehabilitation work for Surrey Bend Park. But yeah, certainly wherever possible that we can collaborate with our neighbors, especially on referrals, because sometimes it just feels so isolating. You know, you get hundreds and hundreds of these referral documents every year, and anytime that we get to reach out or connect with another nation to discuss some of these referrals and some of these issues is always it's always beneficial.
Thanks, Ashley. So a question here, I think, that would be towards all the speakers for the whole panel, is around this idea of values. And Shannon, you were talking about that. Well, you both talked about that, about values just being so different between First Nations and the province. The question is from Grace, and she's asking if you can elaborate a little bit more on this idea of values and the differences between them. So Shannon, maybe you want to start.
I will use BC Hydro as an example because we've spent a lot of years, last 20 years, working with BC Hydro to come up with our settlement in 2011. And the intentions of everyone there are usually pretty darn good. And but what we found is we have an adaptive decision-making process for operational water regimes in the territory, as long as they fit within the values of BC Hydro. So when it's uncomfortable for BC Hydro to step outside or talk about the socioeconomic impacts to the culture as a result of their water change, for example, throwing up to 200 CMS, which is a lot of water for our Bridge River, down the Bridge River, which is the heart of where people fish in the territory, that's a big deal for us, because you're changing the relationship of the Stát'imc to something that they've done from time immemorial, and it's problematic. And as soon as the conversations get uncomfortable, they default to their value system. And it's natural, and I get it, but we haven't been able to push people out of the box, and the province is trying to get a little bit out of the box by dealing with the cumulative impacts assessment and the tools that they're developing on that. But again, that's problematic too, because the decision making is a yes or no, and there's no place for engagement and incorporation of our values. So I don't know exactly how else to respond to that, other than our court systems are based on the colonialization of this nation, and so the governments are built on that, and so it is inevitable that it's a certain set of values, and it's just tricky trying to keep pushing people out of that box. It's so entrenched. To think about things like 7 generations down the line, to think about cumulative impacts, to think about holistic decision making, to think about actually people's relationship to the water. When they're praying to the water, the elders hear messages from the water. You have people that are working outside of this world, and they don't understand that kind of relationship, the depth of the relationship to the water, and so if you don't understand that kind of relationship, you don't understand the kind of impacts that are being felt in the territory. So.
Thanks, Shannon. And I'd welcome anyone else on the line too, if they have thoughts on this question, because it is such a big question. If they wanted to offer their thoughts in the chat box, that would be great. Ashley and Genevieve, did you want an opportunity to respond to that question as well?
Yeah, I think that Shannon really covered it, but just to add, each nation has their own core traditional values, and that's different from nation to nation, but I think that's something that's common amongst all nations, is trying to operate within the context of these traditional values within a colonial framework, which is really what Shannon was talking about. Just everything from the court systems to the way that the bureaucracy in the province and the federal government, just the way everything runs, is very counter to how First Nations have operated in the past and continue to operate. So yeah, it's just frustrating because you come up against a lot of brick walls, and you try so hard to change this framework that the province and the federal government has, but it's very difficult because it's been like that since colonialism happened. So yeah, very challenging. That's something we come up against a lot.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm just seeing the time, and I do want to keep an eye on that. We did start a few minutes late, so we can go for another few minutes, but I'll just take a couple more questions, and we have a really good one here, it looks like, from Hunts, who's saying thank you to the presenters. He says, the mention of uncomfortable conversations came up, which for me is a reflection of how profoundly challenging some of these issues are. Do any of the speakers have ideas about how to shape policy development processes in a way that these conversations can begin to address the underlying differences rather than revert to established value systems? So really a conversation about what underlies governance. Big question, but I'll open that up to all the speakers for your thoughts and reflections. Maybe Genevieve?
Shannon,
okay, yeah, Shannon.
I don't want... Sorry.
No, go ahead, Shannon.
I was just going to say, and again, example with BC Hydro is, so we've gone from 6 CMS to 200 CMS on a fish-bearing stream, and the First Nations are obviously very concerned about spawning, rearing, habitat, but because we only have 1 year of scientific data, BC Hydro isn't open to changing their operational regimes because it's uncomfortable or it costs them money or they don't have scientific proof. So when you default to always scientific proof, that's delegitimizing the First Nations knowledge and understanding of the system and how it works. So if people could be open to okay, maybe we don't have the 10 years of scientific data, but let's change up this water regime and figure out how we can do this best for fish. Maybe that would go farther, but institutions aren't necessarily willing to do that because they have to be able to legitimize their decision-making process, and currently our knowledge isn't considered as legitimate as scientific knowledge. So to shape the policy process to make it more open, if someone had the answer to that, if they could please let me know, that'd be super awesome, because we're having a trouble trying to figure out how to do that.
Just to follow up on that, Shannon, how have some of, I mean, you described like the RELAW project, for example, and I was curious if you foresee potentially maybe the outcomes of that project shaping some of these decision-making processes, and maybe actually it would be worth just giving a little one or two quick sentences description of what that RELAW project involves, if you're able. I think that'd be of a lot of interest to the folks here.
No problem. So the way I like to think about the RELAW project is in non-Native Christian world, the Bible, through its Bible stories, informed the values on which the institution was developed. The RELAW project is taking our cultural stories and transformer stories and creation stories, and we're pulling out the values from those stories in order to develop our laws based on our values. That's the best kind of analogy I can make of that. So the idea is to use our sets of values to develop laws, and that's why it's called RELAW. It's a law. We're using the term law because it provides legitimacy. Instead of just saying our traditional ways or whatever, we're trying to use the term law to add legitimacy in the conversations. But that's the intent of the RELAW project, is to bring forward our laws in an equal, and our values in an equal footing.
Thanks,
and what
Shannon.
was part two? What was part two of the question?
I think Hans was asking how do we shape these policy development processes, decision-making processes. So I was curious about how something like the RELAW project might change some of these underlying Western science-based kind of approaches to the challenges that the Stát'imc people care about.
We're certainly hoping so.
Mm-hmm. We have we have time for one. Yep.
I was just going to add, it's Kate. Yeah,
yes.
I was just going to add that I think part of making those changes to the processes is obviously it needs time. I think a lot of communities are often under the gun to be reactive to situations versus being proactive. So the Water Sustainability Act is a good example where it came into place and didn't engage communities adequately enough and didn't provide the time, resources, or mechanisms for that to happen. And that means for First Nations to have the time internally to figure out what it means to them, in that case, the Water Sustainability Act, but also in terms of other processes, what their traditional processes are, and what Shannon's saying in terms of the RELAW, and how that can then lay a foundation for when First Nations are coming together with other governments and sitting at the table, that this is the foundation for how that discussion will start. And so it's I think bringing the right people to the table that are open to exploring these uncomfortable or new, I shouldn't even say uncomfortable, but yes, they may be uncomfortable conversations, but new ways of looking at these types of processes that aren't your typical Western science way, that haven't been the way that they have been since colonialism. Like it's turning it on its head, and it's finding the space to allow for that to happen and for people to listen and learn and want to be part of that dialogue.
Thanks, Kate, and I'm glad that you included the WSA in that comment, because there was some questions about the WSA. Those are really good. Those are some really good thoughts, and I think to wrap up. I want to offer to Genevieve and all of the two other speakers, in addition to Kate, a chance for any last comments or words, and then we can wrap up for the day. I also want to just note that Kelly Bannister has made a comment here that in response to the discussion about law and value systems and changes needed, it might be of interest to check out a project that's not on water, but on evolving legal tools and norms through Indigenous lenses, and she's provided a link there. So to wrap up, why don't we have a closing comments from Genevieve, Shannon, and then Ashley.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that it was taking me a while to think about Hans's question, but I really agree with what Kate said. So that was good answer, Kate. And just to finish, I would say, because I saw a question about the WSA, like I think it's important to remember that. As are the results from the research that we were discussing, show that there really is very low capacity for First Nations to be able to have meaningful discussions. You know, you could ask First Nations to come to the table now and try, I mean, some are more ahead than others, but generally, like, if trying to talk about policy development, I mean, there needs to be some education first, and there hasn't been a lot of funding available to help develop that capacity. And so I would just say funding, so important. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Genevieve. Ashley and then Shannon, do you want to provide some closing comments?
Yeah. Hey everybody, it's Ashley here. I just wanted to again thank Polis and Genevieve for inviting me to this webinar. I think it's, I was speaking to one of my colleagues earlier about how I was doing this presentation, and he remarked that, you know, it's just so good that we have this opportunity to really share what some of our challenges are. And I just really hope that we see things change where we get to a point that traditional knowledge is valued and that First Nations are provided with capacity funding to pursue different studies and really just dive into the technical side of a lot of these referrals that we receive. And yeah, just again, thank you very much. Haichka CM.
Yeah, I mean, the thanks is really to the speakers for their wonderful insights. So just to mention, someone has asked if the webinar will be available as an archived version. We will make the information available. So last words to Shannon before we say goodbye for the day.
Okay, well thank you, Natasha, Polis, First Nations Fisheries Council for the opportunity. I would just like to encourage everybody who does work with First Nations or proponents that work in First Nations territories to come with an open mind and an open heart in conversations. Come early in the process. Don't wait until your policy is already developed. Just come and be open, and the relationship is critical and key. I spend my entire days under trying to work on FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent. The goal of all First Nations should be free, prior, and informed consent of decisions that are happening in their territory. We cannot do that without funding so that we can make informed decisions. Funding is key to the success of all of this, and the more people understand that, the more support we can have, and we can get to the place where we're not putting our leadership in a place to make decisions without full information. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you again to all the presenters for their fabulous presentations and insights, and to everyone for tuning in today. We will follow up with some of the discussion summary from today and look forward to continued conversations with everyone.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Genevieve.